This is Red Ice Radio. From the visible to the obscure. RedIceCreations.com.
Welcome back. My name is Henrik Palmgren. It's good to have you all with us today. Thank you for listening. Dennis McKenna is an ethnopharmacologist, author, and brother to well-known psychedelics proponent Terence McKenna. He joins us today to discuss his new book project called The Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss, and that is going to be about Dennis and Terence's work. Stay with us for an interesting conversation about humanity, the influence of psychedelics, our past, and where we are heading. It's good to have you with us on Red Ice Radio, Dennis. Thank you for coming on the program. It's a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you obviously for your time here today. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm very pleased. I'm very pleased to be here.
Excellent. We have a lot to talk about, and we have an hour here with you today, Dennis, and we're going to get into some of the projects here that you are currently working on, specifically related to I guess the working name for now is The Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss. And why don't you, at the outset here, tell our listeners a little bit about this new book project that you're currently working on, Dennis?
Okay, well, this is going to be a memoir, basically. I think that, now the time is right to write this story. There's a great deal of expectation, not to say hysteria, around 2012. So there's a great anticipation of 2012, and I think in the culture, a sort of awareness that we live in a time of accelerating change. And Terence, and to a certain degree myself, but really Terence deserves the credit for being way out in front of a lot of people on this sort of millenarian expectation around 2012. Whether he's right or wrong about that, he certainly has identified a cultural theme that's becoming more and more common. So I thought it was a good time to come out with this. On the cultural level, it's good. The way the book is scheduled, it will come out in September of 2012, which is a good time for it. Mm. If the world's going to end, you'll have time to read it, and if the world isn't going to end, you can finish it and give it away for Christmas. Right?
That's perfect. It's a great plan, actually. Yeah.
It's perfect. And so that is the projected rollout date, and so in that sense, it makes sense to do the book now, before 2012. From a personal point of view, it makes sense for me because I just turned 60 in last December. And at that age, you start thinking about thresholds and transitions. And, in some ways, 60, separates the earlier part of your life from whatever is left of it in a fairly definitive way, even more, I think, than crossing over into 50. And so I'm at that stage, and I have never had a chance to really tell this tale from my perspective, which is different than Terence's, obviously. And so now's the time. And, I decided to set up this Kickstarter site on the advice of one of Terence's old agents. I had thought about trying to find a publisher and go the conventional route, which I think I could probably do, but he suggested this alternative, and that seemed attractive to me, so I decided to do this, and judging by the response so far, it's been a good idea. People seem to resonate with this idea.
Absolutely. We will. I definitely want to ask you a little bit more for those who don't know what Kickstarter is and what that means, Dennis. But I want to ask you, I guess, first here in terms of Timewave 0, the software, and 2012 and all of this. What was that your main, how should we put it, incentive for kicking off this project, or was there something else you felt that is necessary and important to tell in terms of the work that both you and Terence did throughout the years together?
Well, yeah, it's partly motivated by 2012 and the desire to get something out before 2012 comes. I mean, I personally am rather skeptical that the world's going to end on December 21st, 2012. So, but you never know. So it might be good to get something out. Partly it's a personal thing. The time has come. Partly it's, Terence has been gone since 2000. And so many of the transformative events that have shaped the last decade, he didn't see. He did not live to see. But on the other hand, I think he'd be totally comfortable, sitting around talking with us about this, because basically what he suggested was that, there was going to be a time of tremendous upheaval and changes like we never anticipated, and all that's happened, I mean, the 9/11 and the tsunami in Japan and the earthquakes and the various, wars, the breakout of whatever it is in the Mideast, political unrest, certainly, if not longing for democracy. I mean, I think that, if you, I mean, what Terence tried to do in a way with the Timewave, not entirely successfully, in my opinion, but the idea was correct. The idea to try to quantify or put a mathematical model onto the ingression of novelty into our world. And, it was a good try. And in some degree, it might be said that it works. This goes back really to notions of Alfred North Whitehead's philosophy, the idea that novelty is something that ingresses into the continuum. There really is something new under the sun every day. The question is, does it, we seem to be in a time of accelerating change.
Right.
I think subjectively we all have that feeling. So in some ways the novelty theory, the time wave, was a way to, in some ways, get a handle on that, put a framework around it. Whether or not it was totally correct in all its details, which I don't think it was, but it gave people a sense of sort of a tool with which to grapple with, if you will, this accelerating change, much in the same way that astrology or the I Ching or these kinds of things, they may not be scientific, but within their own terms, they're valid. They carry a certain subjective validity. You may not be able to, prove them as a theory, but they give people a feeling, some way of, they're a useful, I guess, cognitive tool for understanding what's happening to us.
That's right, and so many things are unfolding incredibly quickly, and this is the basic premise of the idea, as far as I've understood it as well. New things coming in, basically, change as well. The question, obviously, though, is if this is what you and if what you believe Terence was anticipating as well. We have seen a tremendous, obviously, technological, kind of revolution, I guess we can say in one sense, in terms of the booming of the internet and so forth as well. But is there any area, I guess, that you personally feel that it's kind of has stagnated a bit? It hasn't accelerated as quickly as you has anticipated, Dennis?
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm in many areas of technology. I think in cultural change and kind of change in global consciousness do seem to be accelerating, and they are going to profoundly influence the world that we're evolving into. As always, the institutions that don't seem to be able to respond to this in any way that's other than the negative are politics and religions. And I would have to say that these two institutions, which are very often very tightly intertwined, they are the major forces that are trying to stem the tide of change. They're very invested in the status quo. And it's a zero-sum game, because the status quo is being swept away, and it's being swept away by forces that, are inevitable and that are not really being recognized for what they are by the institutions and people that want to resist it.
Yeah.
I mean, there are, it's hard to maintain an ideology or a worldview that's based on 14th century understandings of the way the world is. I mean, we know the world isn't flat, but some of those same notions are still, very sort of current in religious ideologies. And politicians and politics in general, and the ability of governments to respond to people's needs is, in this day and age, even more pathetic than it's always been. And I think that technology and cultural change and artistic change and to some degree, psychedelics play a role here. They are changing people's consciousness on a mass scale. Politics is almost irrelevant, and the stupider and more ideologically rigid politicians become, the less relevant it gets. Most people just ignore it because there's really nothing there.
That's right. I would agree with that, and it's an obvious,
it has the ability to impact our lives in really profound ways.
Sure.
Especially if and we do need smart people running things, and we see almost in politics these days a knee-jerk reaction against that. It's almost as though stupidity is enshrined as the norm of the day. And that's distressing.
Indeed it is. And it's an obvious fact how closely related the Timewave Zero idea or the novelty theory is to obviously the Mayan calendar. And as far as I've understood it, then this was developed separately, if you will, to, the Terence and you didn't know about the Mayan calendar as such by the time you were developing it. Which it's a really interesting thing, and obviously if we do tie the Mayan calendar into it, we understand certain interpretations anyway of the Mayan calendar seems to suggest that we're talking about collapse and a fall of certain structures, and if nothing else, we can certainly see it, as you mentioned, Terence, both in the political but also in the economic system right now. So we're back to that idea that all these things that are unfolding and happening obviously necessarily don't mean at least in the outset, something good. Maybe at the end it will be something good because of the effects, that will happen consequently, meaning the economic system crashes and collapses, and hopefully something better, if you will rise out of those ashes. But maybe you can talk a little bit about the comparison there in terms of the Mayan calendar, and also what you see is happening with a lot of the structures in the world, economics and government, Dennis.
Well, I think, the Timewave was developed independently of the Mayan calendar, and it was only later in sort of the revision and refinement of the idea that we became aware of the Mayan calendar. And the Timewave was more Terence's bailiwick than mine. But the Timewave, from the time of its conception to now, has undergone some transformations, in the sense that there has been an ongoing effort to identify what is the end point, because the whole thing depends on where you set the end point, and then you run that from that point back against the known historical record, and you look for these correlations or these resonances, right? So if you don't have the endpoint set correctly, you can be off. Of course, we're talking about a scale that on some levels is billions of years. So
yeah.
but it can be off. So I think Terence eventually settled on an endpoint that was in 2012 that was close to the Mayan end date, that was different from it than by 2 or 3 months, and basically found out about the end of the Mayan calendar and kind of made an executive decision that, well, it's not that far off, so let's go with that.
Right, it's basically the same idea that is presented here, but it comes from 2 different points of view, so to speak.
Yeah, and these are not the only world calendrical traditions that, that point to 2012 as a major transitional year. So I think in the interests of practicality, he decided to go with that date because the one that he had calculated was very, very close to it. And because the scales are so big, it was easy enough to shift. Now, as far as what is projected by the Timewave, that's the tricky part because all it purports to do is to quantify the ingression of novelty into the system, into the world. And so that's a slippery concept. What do we mean by novelty? And the Timewave, and to a certain degree the Mayan calendar, postulates this ontological shift that's going to take place, that is taking place. What are the consequences of that? It's hard to imagine a global shift in consciousness or a global shift in the way things are that is anything but bad if it's a wrenching shift. I mean, we can think about, earthquakes, asteroid impacts, tsunamis, all of these things, but these are things we'd rather not have happen, right? I mean, these are disaster scenarios, and even the enormous disasters that we've had that the last decade has witnessed doesn't even come close to having a global impact. I mean, the only thing I can think of that could have that kind of an impact would be an asteroid impact, of a large asteroid, possibly some kind of a cosmic event like a gamma ray burst, these sorts of things. None of these can be good for, the continued sustenance of life on Earth. So, that doesn't mean they're not going to happen. They may happen, but it's very hard to, and in fact, they almost certainly will happen, because they've happened in the past. But it's hard to nail that down to 2012, and we kind of have to hope as people that, that won't happen. So, because that wouldn't be a very good outcome for almost everybody on Earth. So the question is, what else might happen that, would be short of a global, geological or climatic disaster. And I do think that the political changes that are sweeping the world, the collapse of world economies, the inevitable end of the oil era, all of these things, the acceleration in, on the positive side, the acceleration in technological change, the advances in computing power, we are headed towards some kind of a singularity. And in some ways, it seems to be a race between the positive forces and the negative forces are going to determine the outcome. It's a question of which one gets there first. You can think of changes, technological changes that would make an incredible amount of difference, in the outcomes. The emergence of true artificial intelligence, for example.
Right. Actually, I was sitting here and wanted to ask you a little bit about that because I remember hearing Terence talking about that once. He almost seemed to have a position that AI was almost like if I could encapsulate it right, almost like this was an alien presence, if you will. This is what we were going to make contact with, not ET from out there, if you will, but something that we developed. And is that something you would agree with, Dennis? Do you feel the same way about that?
Yeah, I do. I think that, it's always possible that we will make contact with ET or something that's not from this planet. I mean, we can all hope for that. And hopefully they'll be kind, hopefully they will be benevolent. There's no guarantee of that. They could be, really mean bastards.
That's right. That's right. We don't know.
In which case we can pretty much, it's all over. But I think the important thing is the contact with an intelligence that is not human, whether we build that or whether it comes from outside, could be a huge wake-up call for our species, historically and even evolutionarily, the idea that, we're not the alpha, species necessarily. We're not the smartest kid on the block. And I think that would be a very sobering realization. I think that contact with an alien species, or even contact with a non-human species that was clearly smarter than us, I think that would pretty much be the end of the major world religions, but not without a lot of resistance and hysteria. Ultimately, all to the good, I think. They do have to go, or many of the assumptions that, people are invested in are not helpful to the further evolution of our species. In fact, they are impediments. So, but it won't happen lightly. So there'll be a lot of turmoil around that. There will be a lot of turmoil around potential advances in neuroscience, and we don't know where that's going to go. I mean, are you familiar with the work of Ray Kurzweil?
Absolutely. The whole transhumanist movement as such, combining, the neurological, things that we're learning now in terms of the brain and implementing that with machines. That's a whole different area that humanity might take off into as well, Dennis.
Mm-hmm. And we are inevitably evolving toward that as well. So, these, and I think that touches on a point that I think that is sometimes overlooked in these discussions of novelty. And what is novelty, and how does it express itself, in a historical time frame? And this is kind of where Terence and I don't necessarily see eye to eye. I agree with Terence and we're really just taking a page out of Alfred North Whitehead, the idea that novelty is a quality of the continuum, if you will, or a quality of being that ingresses, into reality in some ways. But does it do so in an abrupt way, or does it do so in a gradual way? And Terence liked to talk about novelty as something that erupts abruptly, and so it was possible to say there will come a moment on December 21st, 2012, when the continuum collapses entirely, or whatever happens, whatever is projected to happen will happen. But that view ignores the predecessors and the precursors of novelty. He discusses the first time that the atom bomb was dropped on Hiroshima as a major historical novel event, and of course it was. But it was the outcome of many other novel events that were less noticed, less spectacular, and yet, that event never would have happened if those other things so where was the true novel event? Was
right.
when Einstein had the ideas for the equations that made atomic fission possible? Was it when the first sustained nuclear reaction was triggered in Chicago by Oppenheimer's group, or was it the first bomb that was detonated at Los Alamos? Or so where was the novel event? I think it's more like novelty doesn't so much erupt into history as it does, it kind of oozes into history.
Right.
You know, it ingresses slowly. And, you know, and almost without noticing it. I mean,
right.
if you think about how it is now compared to how it was 10 years ago or 15 years ago, and people will say, you know, well, things weren't really that different, you know, we're still here. But really, if you think about it, they're quite different now, you know. And if you go back even further, you know, how different is it now to, say, 1950 or 1930 or, you know, I mean, we live in a transformed world. There's no doubt about it. So novelty is a quality that expresses itself through history, you know, and so, you know, the time wave is useful to think about this, but I think it's deceiving in the sense that, you know, you can point, all the wave does is the wave either goes up or down, right? And if it goes down, that's thought to mark a point where there's a big ingression of novelty. But you have to look at the precursors to what led to that for it to make sense.
That's right. And I guess what you're saying here as well is that there is a delay in the implementation. Excuse me. The effect obviously takes a little bit of a time. But what if then is the area, if you will, then that we're entering into right now, has to do with some of the Kurzweilian, ideas in terms of the technological singularity that we have. What if an AI is born on that day or that month, if you will, and the extreme quick progression of a technological evolution or whatever we can call it actually begins to take place at that point? That's still a possibility, isn't it?
That's still a possibility. Yeah. Very much so. I mean, I don't know if you mark it. Is there a moment when the AI suddenly becomes conscious, you know, and super intelligent and in the next 30 seconds assesses the situation, decides that these stupid monkeys are the problem and gets rid of us?
Right, exactly.
You know, I mean, that's entirely possible that will happen. Hopefully that won't. I mean, Kurzweil says no, they will be made in our image, so they'll love us, you know. And well, let's keep our fingers crossed.
We'll see about that. Yeah, see if Isaac Asimov and his robot laws actually work, right? That's the premise.
Yeah, exactly.
But Aubrey de Grey and some of the other, those who study longevity and things like that have been fairly close into, I guess, admitting that we cannot be sure at all that this won't happen. That again, that this artificial intelligence won't, in some way try to deal with us. But I guess what I'd like to ask you about is a little bit what you think is the roots of some of these ideas, because I've talked in the past a little bit with other guests about some of the where some of these ideas come from. Obviously, if the idea to build a computer to go into a technological state to begin with actually stems back from the entheogenic world, coming from psychedelics, that this is the source, if you will, from where humanity got an idea to begin to use tools overall. Would you agree with that, Dennis?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, in our historical era, I think the ideas, I think that entheogens, which I don't really like that term, I prefer psychedelic. I think it's more honest, but that's another conversation. I think that the psychedelics are learning tools, and they played a very important role evolutionarily in enabling us to develop complex language. And all the brain structures that go along with that, the invention of language sort of forced the evolution of complex cortical networks and that sort of thing, because so much of the brain is devoted to either generating or understanding language. And once we had complex language, it was a total game changer for our species, because on the foundation of language, we were able to invent culture. And culture is what is driving change in our species now, even to the point where, biological evolution is a slow process, and it's pretty irrelevant right now because, what's driving change is cultural change and technological change, which is part of culture, the invention and application of technology. And because of that, even our biological evolution is going to be affected by that. I mean, I don't think anybody thinks that the way it might have gone had we not become an intelligent species is the way it's going to go. I mean, we are going to, seize the controls of our own evolution. So whatever we evolve into, it will be an artifact that we create. We now actively participate in the process. All bets are off.
Can we...
Natural selection and all that.
Right. Do you think we can attribute everything to the psychedelics? I mean, is the psychedelics the voice of nature, or is it an alien consciousness that have entered our mind and kind of taken over at this point? What do you think about that, Dennis?
Well, that's a question, and I don't really think there's a clear answer. I think that, the psychedelics appear to be, and sometimes they present as something that is not part of the self. Sometimes they represent themselves as the voice of nature or something from nature. They seem alien in some ways. The ideas seem alien. Are they really alien? It's hard to say, because you can always say, well, this has got to be part of the self, right? Some part of the self that is split off and is presenting itself back to you, the observer, the reflector, as autonomous and not necessarily even human, some aspect of the unconscious. In some ways, I don't really think it even matters, it's sort of the old, if it looks like a duck and walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it may as well be a duck, and whether it's part of our mind, part of some intelligent facet of nature, part of Gaia mind, if you will, or something from another dimension or another part of the galaxy, the message seems to be more important than where it actually came from. The message is the thing that is sort of stimulating us toward ever more novelty. And I don't say it's entirely triggered by psychedelics. I think that psychedelics, the important role perhaps of psychedelics, I can't say. I mean, they're still important. People are still learning from this.
But it might have been the initial lightning bolt to get some of the ideas flowing, maybe in humanity's past.
10,000 years ago may have been where psychedelics had their most impact, because if you look at the historical and archaeological records and so on, you can tell from iconography and paintings, carvings, and that sort of thing. There was a point sometime between 20,000 years ago and 2,000 years ago when this technology of using psychedelics just exploded across the planet, and new plants were discovered and brought into it. I mean, it may have started with mushrooms. There's no way to know. I think that mushrooms are the most likely because they're widespread and they don't really require any technology to prepare or consume. You just consume them. Other psychedelics require a lot more sophistication to prepare them. But somehow this technology was acquired by some groups, and then it propagated very quickly all over the world. If you look at the iconography, and every culture seems to have its own, particular teacher plants, if you will, or the ones that they were preoccupied with. In Central America, you've got mushrooms. In South America, you've got ayahuasca and the hallucinogenic snuffs and San Pedro cactus. And all of these are sort of regionally specific, medicines that were used by different groups in the region. So in some sense, I think that this knowledge, once discovered, passes from culture to culture and region to region rather quickly.
It almost seems sometimes that it's springing up on multiple places around the globe at the same time, if we look at the way language is developed and so forth. So from my point of view, it's almost like, again, we have this division. Does that mean that these kinds of plants weren't there before, or is it simply that we didn't, know about them, so we didn't utilize them, we didn't eat them or whatever?
Well, they were definitely there before. There's no reason to think that they suddenly appeared in the ecosystem, but there was a explosion of curiosity, I guess you could call it, and experimentation. It wasn't that the plants weren't there. It was that nobody was focusing on them. And, when initial discoveries were made, whether people accidentally encountered them, I mean, it's most likely they accidentally encountered something, but then that sparked curiosity and people began to, sort of investigate their environment in search of these kinds of plants, and the same kind of thing goes on very much today. It's essentially a scientific process, it's sparked by curiosity. One of the common things that's trotted out about ayahuasca is, how did people discover that out of all the species in the Amazon, 80,000 or more species, just the combination of these two plants results in a very powerful psychedelic. And if you consume either one by itself, they don't amount to much, So,
by the way, speaking of that, Dennis, we had Jeremy Narby with us, who I'm sure obviously you're familiar with, and he mentioned that his idea here, what he heard from the anthropological work that he did, was that the people first ingested datura, another hallucinogenic substance, which kind of told them basically about how to mix these other brews, and that's pretty interesting. That opens up quite a few doors, if you will.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. Why does he say datura specifically? Did he explain that?
No, he mentioned that it was that was one of this, I guess, plants or it's a berry, I guess, that you can ingest that gives you a hallucinogenic effect, if you will, right away, but the consequent contact that was made through that gave the locals there an idea, because they were in communication with something, that told them about how to make the ayahuasca brew, basically.
Yeah. I think that's entirely possible, because datura and these nightshades are one of the plants that you can get a strong effect from with basically no preparation. You can simply eat the seeds or eat the berries and you get a strong effect. The trick with those is that they're toxic. So it's easy to eat too much.
That's right.
But if you hit the sweet spot, you can get a very strong effect. Interestingly enough, those are not true psychedelics. The effects of those are more like deliriants, and they don't really have a psychedelic effect the same as, say, ayahuasca or mushrooms. Having said that, I sometimes tell my students they are not true psychedelics, but they are true hallucinogens. And I make a distinction. Most psychedelics don't really cause what psychologists call hallucinations, which is seeing something that is not there, that you can't tell whether it's there or not. And you may see things on psychedelics that aren't there, but you usually know that they're not there. With datura and the other nightshades, you may see things that you have no idea if they're there or not. In fact, you're totally convinced they are there, like another person, for example. It's very common to see another person who may tell you things like things about yourself or things about how to prepare medicines. I mean, it's entirely possible. If you look at indigenous worldviews, there's usually a world of spirits and non-corporeal entities, what we might call ghosts and things like that. These are part of the reality for indigenous peoples. And, you can say, well, how can they believe, such obvious poppycock? There aren't those such things. I would urge the skeptics to go into the forest one night and eat a sufficient dose of datura. They will be convinced that they live in a world of spirits and non-human entities, because they will see them. I mean, they may, after the experience, they may go back to their Western rationalism and say, well, I took a drug and it is this. But on the experiential level, they will definitely see those things and communicate with those kinds of entities. So Jeremy may be on the right track here.
Does it ultimately matter, do you think, if these things, the spirits, the things people see, if they are out there, really, in a sense, or if they're internal? I mean, if you ask somebody like, Michael Persinger with his God helmet theory and all that as well, he would say that, this is just internal stuff that is triggered by misfirings in the brain, and it's all internally created, basically, in that sense. But from my point of view, that doesn't really matter. But what's your comment on that, Dennis?
Well, I think, I kind of think it doesn't really matter, and I think that the distinction between external and internal is a false duality, in some ways, because if you think about it, everything is internal. We live inside a hallucination, right, that our brains create in order for us to be able to exist. I mean, everything that comes to us from the outside comes through that sensory neural filter known as our senses, which have a lot to do with keeping information out as much as it does admitting information. And the information that it lets in is then processed by our brains, by other elements of our brain, which take this raw data and turn it into essentially a story or a movie or a hallucination, which we call the consensus reality hallucination. Or sometimes I call it the serotonin hallucination, but there's obviously a lot more than serotonin going on. So if you think about it, we live in a world that we create. We're always like in a dream, and the world, the external world, physics tells us, we know enough about physics to know that it doesn't really resemble the world that we experience at all. That's a fiction that we construct in order to make it convenient to navigate through this world, and it corresponds to reality close enough that we don't, as a rule, step in front of buses or go walking off cliffs and things like that. So it has survival value, and it's really everything comes from inside, or everything comes through those filters. Even the measurements that we make with our most objective scientific instruments ultimately have to be interpreted by someone.
Yeah.
So, this is the question.
We're trapped in that, if you will, in one sense.
We're really trapped in that. Yeah. I mean, it's the old, if a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it conundrum, or some of the current, wilder views of quantum mechanics. There is no reality without an observer to constellate, to collapse the wave function. And it may be that is the way it is, Having said that, I also think that, I really think that neuroscience, as it exists now, is not really able to say whether, consciousness, whatever that may be, is something that is generated by the brain, or whether it's a property of the continuum. And the brain is more like a detector of consciousness, much in the way a radio is a detector of radio waves, and you change the channels and you get different programs coming in. It may be that's what consciousness is. The brain can tune to different wavelengths and get different information impinging. And the psychedelics in that context become, something that lets you tune into some channels that are normally blocked.
That's right.
Could
AI help us out of this trap, if we can put it that way, as in a kind of a truly objective observer of reality, do you think?
An objective observer of reality. Well, I don't know. I mean, I think the short answer is I don't know. I think in order to answer that question, you have to build an artificial intelligence. You have to make an artificial intelligence. And the tricky part is, will you recognize it when you make it? How do you, if you're interacting with a system, how can you say absolutely with certainty that this is an intelligent system?
Yeah, that's right. Or is it just intelligent enough to respond in the things you've pre-programmed it to do?
Or
basically?
are they simulating intelligence,
Right.
And this is a question that could be asked of many of the people.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. Good.
Right?
Yeah, good idea.
I know I'm not simulating intelligence, but I'm not so sure about you. How do I know you're
That's
not
right.
a sophisticated computer program?
That's right. I think that, I think you're onto something when you mentioned that our senses, potentially opens up on psychedelics, that the filters that our brain puts on reality are kind of open up, which would, if that's true, which would imply that the reality is incredibly more rich than we give it tribute to, but this is the reason, as you mentioned before, that this has been a necessity maybe for our development. If all our senses were wide open, Dennis, and if everything was flooding in, if you will, at 100% all the time, we wouldn't be able to cope, I think, with reality. This filtering process has been a necessary a mechanism, if you will, right?
Yes, yeah. It's absolutely necessary for survival, so it has evolutionary consequences. But now, if you're a hunter-gatherer, or if you're living in a situation where you want to be pretty attuned to your environment, you never know when that saber-toothed tiger might show up, and you want to be on top of it when that happens. Most of us don't live now in such a life-threatening situation, so there are times when it's better to let your defenses down and let things flow in that normally would not, because you can learn from those things. This is really the whole rationale when it comes to psychedelics, the importance of set and setting. We have to pay attention to setting because we want to do it in a place that's safe, basically a place where we don't have to pay much attention to our external reality. We are in a reasonably safe place. We can concentrate on what's coming in from other channels, and and if we can do that, we can learn a lot from what we are genetically and evolutionarily programmed to filter out most of the time, because it's not immediately relevant to our survival, our reproduction, our next meal, all of these things. But it could be very relevant to our eventual, evolution and learning, and maybe crossing some of these threshold points so that we do become something, more than human.
Are you afraid of some of these things? I know that a lot of people out there, Dennis, are very, very, fearful, and I think in some regards rightly so, about the invasion both of technology but also what this might turn the human species into, because at the end of the day we're still talking about someone sitting behind the machines and programming them, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, am I afraid? Sometimes. I don't know if I am afraid. And most of the time, I mean, I kind of think that this is happening. This is inevitable. And it's happening it's not happening so rapidly that it's alarming. Well, things are happening rapidly, but I think I mean, it's sort of like it's going to happen. It won't hurt a bit. By the time we look back and realize that it's happened, it'll be too late to change it. It's sort of like I said earlier. If we look back to a person, even in the mid to late 20th century, the way we were in 1980s, 1990s, life was very different,
Yeah.
and we lived through that. We're still kind of the same people, but we don't think probably the same way that we did then.
That's
so,
probably true, yeah.
We evolve into new ways of thinking. I think that ultimately, change is good. I think that, we are a changing species. I think that evolutionary, cultural, intellectual death in some ways happens when you can't adjust to change. I mean, we are changing all the time. It's the nature of biological being. And we certainly know that we have to change radically just about everything about us, from biology to social institutions to technology, if we're going to survive on this planet. I mean, we have made a lot of bad choices, since the Industrial Revolution, that have put us in great danger. And so now we sort of have to have a much clearer understanding of what's going on and what we might be able to do to fix it. We haven't been thoughtful in the decisions that we've made. And as a species, we find it very hard to project into the future. I mean, if we look back at the end of the 70s, for example, some of the questions that we're now confronted with regarding energy and petroleum and all that were asked back in the 70s, back at the end of the 70s, and sort of swept away. They were like, yes, these are important questions. We don't have to think about them. If we had addressed them 30 or 40 years ago, we would not be facing a lot of the problems that we're facing now. So we're a frustrating species in that sense, that we seem to respond to things under pressure. Only when we're under threat that we can grasp that we respond. So it's very hard to anticipate, if we do something now, what will the consequences be 30 or 40 years from now? If we had had that conversation, and seriously had that conversation, then I think we'd be in much better shape than we are now. But we didn't do that. So now we're faced with a lot of decisions that we have to make that are, we don't have the luxury of time anymore.
Yeah, the one thing that also amazes me is that we're still here despite everything. Sometimes when you look back into history, you're kind of amazed that we've made it this far. But I guess that's encouraging, Dennis. But I want to talk.
It's encouraging, and I think every culture probably exists on this cusp. I mean, probably every culture thinks that they live in the end times.
Right.
They live on the absolute cutting edge of history, and it's true. I mean, the present is the cutting edge of history, so we're no different than every culture in that respect.
Absolutely, I think you're right. And so, Dennis, you're calling this project the Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss. Tell us a little bit about the name, and obviously then I want to discuss a little bit about the Kickstarter project again, how that is going to be done, and also tell us obviously how people can get involved in the project, because that's what the Kickstarter idea is there. So tell us about that, Dennis.
Yeah. Well, the Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss is kind of a tongue-in-cheek designation. When my brother and myself and our band of loyal fellow travelers were on the way to the Amazon in 1971, looking for, on one level, hallucinogens. We were looking for obscure hallucinogens. We were looking for much more than that on another level. We were looking for a mystery. We had a sense that we were in search of a profound mystery that would be transformative to ourselves and possibly to the world. And in a certain sense, we were correct about that. So we had this idea that we were going for something incomprehensible and potentially terrifying. And the iconography of the Screaming Abyss, as I mentioned, really probably comes from H.P. Lovecraft. Terence and I were both steeped in science fiction, and Lovecraft was a favorite, and science fiction is really responsible for a lot of our funny ideas and why we grew up so strange. That's another conversation. But he loved to talk about, the horror from beyond the stars, or these sort of, entities that were older than the universe that would come out of nowhere or up out of the pits or whatever. So that was his imagery, and that's where Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss came from. And, it was a humorous, sort of self-deprecating kind of thing. And yet, in some ways, it had a serious tone to it, because we did think that we were really after something pretty profound. So when I decided to write the book, I didn't really think about it that much. This just sort of presented itself as, obviously, this is what it should be called because of the Brotherhood connection. And so I chose that. I chose that as at least the working title. And as I mentioned, I thought about trying to find a conventional publisher for this, which I probably could have. But I talked with Terence's one of his old literary agents, Dan Levy, who helped him get some of his earlier books published, and who is a person I respect a great deal, knows the business. And he said, well, there is this alternative. And he told me about Kickstarter, and I decided to do it. Partly, I'm sure I could have found a publisher for the book. That's not the issue, but partly motivated by greed, because I have talked to enough people to know that if you self-publish the book, if you do it the right way, you earn a lot more money per copy than you do if you go with a regular publisher.
That's right.
So it's partly a greed thing. But then, having said that, what a publisher can do is help you do it the correct way, so you don't make a lot of mistakes along the way. Mm-hmm. And I think I've found the right publisher that will strike a balance, someone that will work with me through the whole process, help me with things like editing and layout, publicity, promotion, distribution, and all that. So it's not simply that they, will print the book and deliver it in a semi-trailer truck to my basement. They will work with me to get it out there.
Right.
Which is one reason why they charge a little more than if I just ordered it up and asked for X number of copies to be printed. I could do that. But I realize this is going to be a big book. I think a lot of people will want to read it, so I'm going to have some support along the way. The Kickstarter project is independent of that, but I guess people know how it works. You basically set a goal that you're trying to raise. You set a time frame to raise it in this case, 60 days. And those two parameters you can't change once you put your project up. You can't change them. But you can edit your project and you can change the incentives. And I've set up a whole raft of different incentives, anywhere from people that want to donate $1 to people that want to donate $5,000. And also, I should say, donation is not the correct word, because this isn't charity. They will get something back for this. Mm-hmm. It may only be a copy of the book, a signed copy of the book. If that's the level they donated at, $35, that's what they'll get. So essentially, I'm pre-selling the book. And then at other incentive levels, I have different things to make it attractive. So it's important that people know that there is a deliverable here. They're making an investment. Their money is not charged. Their credit card is not charged unless we reach the threshold. So the funds that they pledge are held essentially in escrow. If we reach the threshold by the deadline, which is June the 6th, then the Kickstarter will hold the funds for another 10 days or so, and then they'll release them. If we don't reach the threshold by then, no one's credit card is charged, and the only one that loses is me.
That's a pretty interesting idea. I was in on the website, obviously, and so I've been featured quite, heavily in even mainstream media and so forth as well. But it's a pretty interesting way of doing it, actually, as well. And
it's a fantastic way to raise money for creative projects.
Yeah.
I mean, most of the projects on there are, their art or their films, some books. There is, mine is a book. Most of them are asking for much lower levels of funding. Some much higher levels. I mean, some of the technical projects and inventions and so on, which you can also, promote through Kickstarter. I've seen projects funded at well over $1 million through Kickstarter. And another remarkable thing is that if you reach the threshold before the deadline for fundraising is over, that's not the end of it. You can continue to raise funds until the deadline comes. So I have looked at projects out there that, they started out one simple project. Someone wanted to design a tripod for the iPhone so you could use it like a movie camera. They were asking for $10,000. They got $140,000, by the time the window closed. So you never know.
Interesting. Yeah,
I'll be happy if I reach the threshold. I'm not greedy. I mean, it's great if I exceed it, but if I reach it, I'll be very pleased. And I'll be able to do it. I'll be able to do the project. And I think another interesting thing that Kickstarter does is it creates a bond between you and this backer community, people that are actually involved enough to, there's the casual person and then there's the less casual person, and people that are involved enough to actually get out their credit card and pledge a certain amount, stay engaged with the process throughout. And then you have a constituency. I mean, just because you reach the goal, you can still, the project stays up on Kickstarter. You can blog even after the fundraising is over and keep in touch with your backers that way, and anyone else that's interested, so they can follow your progress. So you create this whole invested community. It's much more than just money they're putting up. They feel like they're a part of this project. And in fact, they are.
That's right. Helping to manifest that. It certainly isn't like going to the bank asking for a loan, although I don't know, what happens behind the scenes, but it's a very interesting alternative to this in terms of the business think and starting something up.
Yeah, everyone is getting something, and everyone invests at the level that they're comfortable at, and it forces the project manager, the person that proposes the project, in this case me, you suddenly feel like, wow, I have a great responsibility here. A whole bunch of people have shown faith in me, and are counting on me. So now, if I get the money, the pressure's really on to deliver. So it makes you act more responsibly because you don't want to disappoint everybody. You know, I mean, I don't know how many people, you know, run these projects and get the money and say, okay, toodaloo, you know, I'll send you a postcard from Tahiti or something.
Right.
I can assure my listeners I won't be doing that. I mean, I may go to Tahiti, but I'll be in touch. I'm going to do this work.
That sounds great. We're obviously going to have, you know, the link up, Dennis, but in case people want to go there straight away, Kickstarter.com, and then you can simply search for the Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss. But from our website, redicecreations.com, you can click in through the links there, obviously. And then there's a few other sites as well, Dennis, that we can mention. Arrowwood.org, they will have a little information about this as well, the project, right?
Arrowwood.org, if you want to donate through the nonprofit mechanism. And I'm getting an update. I'm in preparation, and that should be up within the next 24 hours. That'll be up there. Also my Facebook page, and there's actually a group page for the Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss on Facebook as well. But the most direct way to get there is through Kickstarter.com, and just search on my name or on the project's name, or through your website. That's great. And thank you for putting the link up there.
Absolutely. And we will want to say thank you, obviously, for your time here today, Dennis. We really appreciate it. We want to say keep up the great work, and good luck on the book finally. And again, deadline June 6th, right?
That's right.
If you stay tuned to Red Ice Radio, you will be able to hear David Warner Mathiasen, William Bramley, Meron Keshe, John Anthony Hill, Adrian Selbucci, Henry McCow, Gilad Atzmon, Israel Shamir, Scott Onstott, Christopher Dunn, Jurelina, Max Egan, Josh Reeves, and many others. My thanks to everyone at Red Ice, Fredrik, Lana, Elizabeth, and of course to you for listening. You're welcome to tune in again. We'll be back in just a few days. Until then, take good care of yourself and keep your eyes on the website for the latest.